Okay, beautiful. Okay, Parsha. The name of the Parsha is Chayey, Sarah, the life of Sarah. So the name of the Parsha, Chayey, Sarah, means the life of Sarah, and it is found in Genesis chapter 23, verse 1. Sarah dies at age 127 and is buried in the Machpelah cave in Hebron, which Abraham purchases from Ephron the Hittite for 400 shekels of silver. So that's the first scene. Abraham buys a burial spot for his wife. Abraham's servant Eliezer is sent laden with gifts to Haran, which is Abraham's birthplace, or I guess where he was from, to find a wife for Isaac. At the village well, Eliezer asks God for a sign. When the maidens come to the well, he will ask for some water to drink. The woman who will offer to give his camels to drink as well, shall be the one destined for his master's son. Rebecca, the daughter of Abraham's nephew Bethuel, appears at the well and passed the test. Eliezer is invited to their home, where he repeats the story of the day's events. Rebecca returns with Eliezer to the land of Canaan, where they encounter Isaac praying in the field. Isaac marries Rebecca, loves her, and is comforted over the loss of his mother. Abraham takes a new wife, Keturah. Sagar has passed away, and fathers 6 additional sons, but Isaac is designated as the only heir. Abraham dies at age 175 and is buried beside Sarah by his 2 eldest sons, Isaac and Ishmael. And where was he buried? Yes, you guessed it, in the cave of Machpelah. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story in a nutshell. Now let's take a look at the actual portion. We'll see. We'll start getting into things. Start Torah reading. Okay. So let's first do Hebrew and English. And now okay, let's spend a minute or two on something that is important, and that is the name of the Parsha. So the name of the Parsha is the life of Sarah. That's the name of the Parsha. The problem with that name is that most of the stories of everything in the Parsha refers to not the life of Sarah, but the time after she passes away, right? The portion opens up that Sarah's life was 127 years, but right after that, we talk about almost the passing of Sarah, the burial of Sarah, almost how Isaac finds comfort in his wife, seems like comforted for his mother. So it's almost like moving on from his mother. And then you look at the end of the Parsha, you see how Abraham is marrying another wife, Keturah, and the commentaries explain that Keturah is really Hagar, Sarah's maidservant that was married to Abraham, and Abraham sends away because Sarah tells him to. So in some sense, if you look at the surface, it's almost like every story in this Parsha highlights not the life of Sarah, but the opposite. The fact that she's passing on and almost like being forgotten. That's what it could seem on the surface. But if you look a little deeper, certainly with a Hasidic view, you could see that to the contrary. In fact, the portion is called the life of Sarah because specifically in this portion that you see that Sarah's life's mission or Sarah's legacy actually takes effect even more than during her lifetime. And sometimes that's ironic, where you say after a person passes on, so the life is diminished. Sometimes, in fact, you don't see that the person was truly alive until after their passing, and then you see how the legacy continues. So it's interesting that the Jewish view is that if you want to talk about the life of Sarah, you don't talk about it in her lifetime because maybe the legacy will endure, maybe it won't. But after the passing, that's when you can see the legacy is in fact enduring. Now, let's get specific. If you want to talk about Abraham and Sarah, and there's some tension between the two because they each have a different mission. And the thesis is going to be that after Sarah passes away, it seems like Abraham is actually turning more toward Sarah's mission than his own. So in other words, cementing Sarah's legacy actually takes place not in his not during her lifetime, but after her passing. And you see that almost you could say all the three major stories of this parsha are actually supporting that idea. So let's go through the difference between Abraham and Sarah. So there's basically two differences between Abraham and Sarah. Number one, Abraham, his original name was Avram, exalted father. Abraham is abstract. He's an abstract thinker. Sarah is much more practical and sort of helps bring the abstraction into the real world. That's one difference between the two, more of a practical difference. But then there's also a spiritual difference in their spiritual mission. Whereas Abraham, God tells Abraham that he will be the father of many nations. And that's why God changes his name from Avram to Avraham. He gives him a hey. He says, you're going to be Av Hamon Goyim. You're going to be a father to a multitude of nations. So Abraham, it has a universal message for all of humanity. And indeed, Abraham teaches monotheism, which is not a message for Jewish people. It's a message for all of humanity. And today, I would say, I don't know, a few billion people consider themselves the spiritual heirs of Abraham. So Abraham certainly was successful in his mission of influencing many nations. Sarah, by contrast, is more focused on the specific mission of the Jewish people, which is unique and different than the broader mission of humanity. And that's the tension. And that's why if you look at last Parsha, where Abraham, Sarah wants him to send away his son Yishmael, Abraham doesn't want to, because Abraham says you have to see the good in everybody, and you have to teach everybody, and you have to share the knowledge of God with everybody. And Sarah is like, yes, you do have to influence the whole world, but before you influence the whole world, you have to cultivate a space or a family or a person that is actually unique in their ability to go and then continue spreading the knowledge. In other words, you have to have a particular Jewish people in order to spread the universal message. And that's some sort of tension, because Abraham is looking at the universal message, and Sarah is looking more at the particular Jewish message. And Abraham has a little bit of both. And there's some tension between the two. And each of us has some tension between the two, because in some sense, we're human and our mission is to the entire world. On some message, we're Jewish and we have a Jewish path. And they're both true, and they're not a contradiction, but there could be some tension between the two. And the thesis is going to be that if you look at this week's Parsha, you will see that Abraham is following in Sarah's footsteps and focusing and cultivating on Sarah's mission. And that's why, even though the entire Parsha refers to the time after Sarah passes away, but you can still refer to the Parsha as the life of Sarah, because now she's truly alive, because life is enduring and her legacy is enduring. So very quickly, Abraham lived in Israel for many decades after God told him to move to Israel. But Abraham is a nomad. He's moving from place to place. He's living in a tent. He has a motel. He opens up his tent. He invites people in. He doesn't purchase land. Purchasing land, as you will see, is a sign of permanence, permanent settlement in one space. And that doesn't happen until Sarah passes away. In other words, because of Sarah and for Sarah, Abraham, who is an abstract person, abstract thinker, not such a practical person, Abraham forces himself to plant himself in a very deep way in one specific place. And that's the idea of buying not just a burial place, but a burial plot. Plot means for the family. It means we're burying our dead here. It means we're not going anywhere. It means this is our place. So you see that Sarah is bringing Abraham from the world of abstraction to the real world through that purchase of a burial spot for her. And we'll continue talking about that because that's a fascinating story. And the Torah gives it a lot of attention, this negotiation of purchasing the first plot of land in Israel. Seemingly, it's not so important for the Torah. I would use this portion to tell you, to teach you how to negotiate, maybe in a negotiation class or in a business school. But why is it in the Torah? So there's going to be a lot of spiritual messages within this story of the negotiation and the purchase of land. But in general, you see, she's bringing Abraham to the practical world. And Abraham's connection to the land, which was abstract, now becomes real and concrete. So that's first point. Then we talk about Abraham selecting a son for Isaac, and Abraham understands he can't just take any girl from the land of Israel, from the land of Canaan. You need someone unique, you need someone special, you need someone from Abraham's own background, and that's why he dispatches Eliezer back to Haran. But again, this highlights that for Isaac, you have to go and you have to find somebody that is unique. And that highlights the uniqueness of the Jewish people as opposed to the idea that the universal message of humanity. And finally, at the end of the story, where he remarries Hagar, even though Sarah wanted Hagar out of the home, but he remarries Hagar. They have more children, but that is not a contradiction to Sarah, because Sarah's problem with Hagar is that Hagar denied that Isaac had a unique role in Abraham's home, that Isaac is considered the spiritual heir of Abraham, uniquely. And that was the problem with Ishmael and Hagar. They did not acknowledge that. At the end of the story, they acknowledge that. And therefore, when you look at the story of the burial of Abraham, just one little verse, but it's an important verse. At the burial of Abraham, it says, and his sons, Isaac and Ishmael, buried him. Now, Ishmael is the older one. You would expect Ishmael to go first. The verse to say, Ishmael and Isaac buried Abraham. No, Isaac and Ishmael buried Abraham. In other words, Isaac is first. And Rashi points out, quotes the Medrash, that shows that Ishmael acknowledged Isaac's unique position with the legacy of Abraham. So it turns out that at the end, Sarah's legacy is right. It turned out you have to influence many people. And in this context, you have many children, and Abraham fathers many nations. That's the goal. But that should not contradict the idea that there's also a unique message for Isaac. And all this happens in this week's parsha. All this happens under the umbrella term of the life of Sarah, ironically, even though it happened after her life, after she passed away. But in some cases, you see that the person is alive specifically after they pass away. So I don't want to get too poetic here, but this weekend is the conference of Chabad rabbis from around the world, and they have a few thousand people that get together for the weekend. And you think about the growth of Chabad as a movement after the Rebbe's passing, and in some sense, however great it was before, after the Rebbe's passing, his legacy actually becomes more popular and more crucial to many, many people, even more than in his lifetime. And that's an example that sometimes the effect of true life could be seen even more than what the person achieves in their lifetime. But if it could endure and it could inspire people even after the lifetime, that shows that you really tapped into something true, something transcendent, something truly alive. So that's a little bit about what's going on now. That's the introduction of the parsha. Any comments, questions, please join. Otherwise, we start talking about the nitty-gritty of the stories. There are two fascinating stories. One is shorter, the negotiation of how Abraham buys the plot of land to bury Sarah. That's number one. And then the big story, most of the parsha, is about how Eliezer is dispatched to choose a wife for Isaac, dispatched to go to Abraham's birthplace to choose a wife for Isaac, and how he makes this plan that he needs someone kind, so he'll ask someone for water, and the girl who gives him water and also gives the camels water, that's the one for Isaac, and how that story plays out, and how eventually Rebecca comes back with him, and they get married, and they fall in love. That's what the verse says. But notice, it doesn't say they fall in love and then they get married. It says they get married and then he loved her. So that's something to talk about as well. If you want to talk about love, like I said, it's almost the only place in the Torah specifically says that 5 books of Moses that I can think of is that there's love in, discusses romantic love. One more case is Rachel and Jacob, but that's later. This is the first case where it says Isaac loved Rebecca, even though Isaac doesn't seem to be the one who's very loving, if you think about his personality and the episodes, but that's what the Torah says, so we can think about that as well. Okay, so that's a little introduction, a little taste. Now we can start getting into the actual stories. Give me a moment, I'll try to pull up the verses, and we can get into business. Okay, so I'll read some of the verses. This is the beginning of the parsha. The life of Sarah was 100 years, 20 years, and 7 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. Sarah dies in Kiryat Arba, which is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. Abraham came to eulogize Sarah and to bewail her. Okay, Abraham arose from before his dead and spoke to the sons of Chayey, saying, I am a stranger and an inhabitant with you. Give me a burial property with you so that I may bury my dead from before me. So he says, listen, I'm living with you. I'm a stranger. A very interesting phrase. We could talk about that in a moment or two. He says, Ger vitoshav. I am a stranger and an inhabitant, or a stranger and a resident. It's almost like not only two terms, but it's almost opposite terms. Ger means I'm a foreigner. I'm not from here. Toshav means I live here. So which one is it? So we can talk about that in a minute. But basically, he says, I need a place to bury. Now, Abraham was a distinguished person. Everybody respected him. So the sons of Chayey answered Abraham, saying to you, listen to us, my Lord. You are a prince of God in our midst. In the choicest of our graves, bury your dead. None of us will withhold his grave from you and bury the dead. So from you to bury your dead. They say you want to bury your dead anywhere. Take anyone, go to any gravesite you want, pick a plot, and you can bury your dead. I mean, it shows how, like they tell him, Nasi Elokim in verse 6, you are a prince of God in our midst. They understand he's a spiritual person. They understand he has a unique connection with God. They say, wherever you go wherever you want. Anyone will go to any grave, any cemetery, any lot. Anyone will give you their grave spot. Abraham is not happy with that. He bows again, which means he's asking for more. And basically he says, let me speak to Ephron, the son of Tzochar. Let him give me the field, but now for the full price, let him give it to me in your midst for burial property. Here Abraham says, I want this specific field, but more importantly, well, they already told him you could bury your dead anywhere you want. More importantly, he says, I want to pay for it, bekesef maleh, I want to pay for it with the full price. Ephron in verse 10, Ephron is sitting amongst the people, and Ephron says, no, that's a bad idea. Verse 11, no, my Lord, listen to me. I have given you the field and the cave that is in it. I have given it to you. Before the eyes of the sons of my people, I have given it to you. Bury your dead. He keeps saying, you want this field? I'll give you this field. It's not a problem. But he doesn't want to take money. Abraham bows again, and he says, no, please let me pay. Finally, the end is he pays him. Pays him a lot of money, 400 silver coins, which is considered a lot of money at the time. And he pays. And after he pays, the verse says that the field of Ephron, which was in Machpelah facing Mamre, was established as Abraham's possession. This included the field and the cave, and it was in it, and all the trees that were in the field, which were within its entire border around. This all became to Abraham as a possession before the eyes of the sons of Chayey, in the presence of all who had come within the gate of the city. And verse 18 describes the burial, and verse 19 describes the burial. Afterwards, Abraham buried Sarah, his wife, in the cave of the field of Machpelah, facing Mamre, which is in Hebron, in the land of Canaan. Now you have verse 20. And the field and the cave within it were established to Abraham as a burial property. Very interesting. We could talk about the relationship of 19 and 20. We'll get to that in a second. There are 20 verses about this. There are 20 verses describing this transaction, which in the Torah is a tremendous amount. Later on, Jacob buys a piece of land when he comes back to Israel. It says it in exactly one half of one verse, right? Here you have 20 verses describing this negotiation. So something is happening here. There's some tension beneath the surface that Abraham has to work through. There's some resistance. What exactly is happening here? Now, you can't say they're bad people. They don't want Abraham in their midst, because they keep saying, take any plot of land. And Abraham wants to buy it. Okay, so why does he want to buy it? So there are all different theories and all different interpretations. The first thing we have to understand is that when Abraham says, I want a burial plot, what he's saying is he wants the people to acknowledge that he belongs in this space. The commentaries explain that in those areas, there were tribal areas, there's like 7 nations in Israel, so it's more like tribes. It's very tribal. And they don't want the strangers settling amongst them if you're not a member of the tribe. So they had unique burial places for people who were strangers. But a stranger would not get a plot of land to bury their dead, because that is a symbol of this is your place. This is where you belong. This is where your children are going to come to be buried. And this is where your ancestors are buried. So this is sort of an anchor in the land. So the first thing Abraham wants is he doesn't want just to be buried anywhere. He wants the people to acknowledge that Abraham, because of the divine promise, Abraham has the right to live in this space, not just live there temporarily, but that he has a permanent connection to the land. That's the first tension that's taking place. And especially if they sell it to him, if it's gifted to you, that means you're here by the benevolence of the giver, right? The person says, okay, I'll host you. You can stay in my house. You don't really belong here. It's not your house. Just because I let you in the house doesn't mean you belong here. But if you're selling him the right to live here or to bury is much more than just live here. Like I said, living here could be temporary, or even you'll live here for a few decades. But it's not that your family is here. It's not that you're establishing what he calls a burial plot, a burial achuza, a space for burial for the entire family. That is much more permanence. And when he buys it, he's getting that recognition. Abraham is receiving that recognition that he belongs in that space. So that's one point to talk about. Then there's something even more interesting, perhaps. And the point here is, how did the people view Abraham? And how did Abraham view himself? So they come to him, and he comes and he says, I have a problem, I have to bury my wife. They say, of course we're going to help you. You're Nasi Elohim, you're a prince of the Lord. You're a spiritual person. How could we not help you? Of course we're going to help you. So Abraham says, okay, you want to help me? Sell me the land. They say, no, we're not selling you land. Why aren't they selling him land? So one way to think about it is because in their mind, the meaning of a spiritual person is that somebody is dedicated to the service of God, removed from the material world, removed from society, separate from the daily economy. And in that culture, if you're a landowner, you have some say in the matter. It's very interesting that when Abraham has this negotiation with Ephron, he wants to buy his plot. It keeps saying the Chol Ba'ei Sha'ari Road. This negotiation happened in front of all the people who are at the gate of the city. In other words, Ephron cannot sell land on his own. He needs town hall's permission. He needs everybody in town to agree. It was some form, I'm not going to say a democracy, but it was some form of all the tribe members, all the people who own the land have a say in who else we're letting in. So they feel that if you're a spiritual person, we're very happy to help you. But to give you a say, sell you land, which means sell you a vote, you have no business telling us how to live our life. You're a spiritual person. Go to the synagogue, go to the study hall, go to the church, go and meditate. You're not going to tell us how to run the economy, when to pick up the garbage, et cetera, how to run daily life. In their mind, spirituality and daily life are two separate things. So we're, of course, willing to respect you. We're, of course, willing to bury your dead, but we're not selling you a vote. We're not selling you land, which means selling you a right to vote. That we don't do. And Abraham says, no, you misunderstand what it means to be a prince of God. You misunderstand what it means to be a Jew. You misunderstand what it means to be spiritual from the perspective of Judaism. And that is that we're not escaping from the world, we're sanctifying the world. And therefore, I want to own the land and have a say in the society, in the culture, because that's the purpose. The purpose is to sanctify, not to escape. And that is what's happening here. And that's why it's a shift that it's not so easy for Abraham to get the people to sell him land, because that means that they're now taking him into consideration in how they live their life. And for them, spirituality should have no bearing in how you run your business affairs and how you run your society. And for Abraham, it's a whole different story. The whole purpose of spirituality, the whole purpose of connection to God, is to influence the way you live in this world. So that's one point to say about the purchase of the cave of Machpelah, of the first place that Abraham buys in Israel in a permanent way. Let's talk about the terms that Abraham said. We mentioned it earlier. Abraham says, Ger v'toshav. I am a foreigner and I am a settler. I'm a foreigner, but I am a resident. So which one is it? A resident implies you live here, and a foreigner implies that you don't belong here. So which one is it? Is he a foreigner or is he a resident? So it is a problem. Like it's different terms. So we'll start with Rashi. Rashi says that Abraham is basically saying, you could treat me as a foreigner and sell me the land. That's okay. Or I have a right to the land. I won't buy it from you, but I have a right to the land because God promised it to me. So then I'm a resident. So in other words, according to Rashi, it's like he's giving them the choice. You could see me as a foreigner and sell me the land, or I don't need to buy it because it's really mine. So that's Rashi's interpretation. But then you get to more mystical interpretations, and you say this is Abraham speaking not just about his relationship to that specific region, but it's almost the relationship of Abraham to living in this world. On one hand, we're part of this world because you have a body and you have physical needs. And in that sense, you're just like everybody else. And in that sense, you're part of broader society because you feel part of society you live in. On the other hand, you also feel like you are a foreigner. You don't really belong here. Why not? Because a spiritual person is in touch with the soul. And from the soul's perspective, this entire life in this world is temporary. And this is not where the soul feels comfortable. The soul feels comfortable in a spiritual connection to God. So when he says, Ger v'toshav, I am a foreigner and I am a resident, what he's saying is, I am both. On one hand, I'm part of you, and therefore I need a piece of land because I'm human and I'm physical. On the other hand, I'm a foreigner. I don't really belong here. I'm not from here. I'm a stranger. I'm here just in passing. I'm passing through. Because that's the relationship of the soul. From the perspective of the soul, I am a ger, I'm a foreigner. And what am I? I'm both. Part of me is physical, permanent. Part of me is spiritual, temporary, doesn't really belong here. This brings to mind the Hasidic story that I said in the past, that once upon a time there was the Rabbi Dov Ber, the successor of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, and he was very poor. And the story is told that he had a wealthy disciple, and the disciple comes to his house, to the Rebbe's house, and he sees how the Rebbe's living in poverty, and he doesn't have a chair, he doesn't have a table, just sitting on a piece of wood. And he says, Rebbe, how do you live like this? So the Rebbe says, 1 second, I don't understand. He says, where did you stay when you came to visit me in the little town of Mezrich? So he says, oh, I stayed in the inn. He says, you stayed in the inn, you're so wealthy. You should stay in a five-star hotel. Well, there is no five-star hotel in this town. You're someone so important. How do you live in the inn when you come to Mezrich? It's a little dingy place. It's not appropriate for you. So the wealthy guy says, look, Rebbe, this is not the way I live. In my house, I have a beautiful mansion. Here, I'm just passing through. If I'm passing through, I could compromise. So the Rebbe said, I'm also just passing through. And in a sense, every person, when you're living on this world, from the perspective of the soul, we're just passing through. So on one hand, we're a resident. On the other hand, this is not the physicality, our physical possessions and our physical life does not define us if you adapt the perspective of the soul. And Abraham was very much in touch with both those perspectives, both the body and both the soul. And that's why when he introduces himself, that's how he introduces himself as, I am a foreigner, I am a resident, because he is both, in fact. Okay, another few points to think about is, it's very interesting that the first place that the Jewish people, or that Abraham buys and purchases in the land of Israel, is a burial place. It's just strange. It's not the first thing you would think of, right? You say, come, you buy a house. Okay, a burial place is a technicality. You need someone to bury the dead. But it's interesting that in the connection of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, and we discussed the permanent connection, even though Abraham was, at this point, Abraham and Sarah were in Israel for a few decades, but they didn't have a permanent connection to the land with a purchase of a plot until Abraham buys the burial spot for his wife. And it's strange that the first thing you would buy is a cemetery. It's just not the natural thing you would think about. So I saw a commentator recently and said something very interesting, that in some sense, what is our connection to the land? When you talk about a physical connection to the land, the physical connection would be about amassing assets, right? In the physical sense, you want to grow, you want to amass assets. So you're not going to talk about a burial plot. A burial plot, the person is dead, you can't do anything with the land. So you would think about buying a field, you would think about buying a home, and that's your connection to the land, premised on the possessions that you could amass. But this Jewish connection to the land of Israel is not about amassing possessions. That's not the goal. The goal is to have a spiritual connection to God in that part of the world, which is uniquely fit for a spiritual connection to God. So here you have the story, their connection to the land is not about amassing wealth, it's about the burial. What the burial represents, the opposite of amassing wealth, it represents that, first of all, there's no wealth after a person passes, but it represents the superiority of the spirit. If you think about it, some commentaries explain that one of the reasons why Abraham had this whole event of buying this burial plot and asking everyone's permission and making this getting into the newspapers about this burial plot is because he wanted to teach them about the importance of burial, to highlight the idea that the soul lives on. Because in the cultures that didn't believe in the afterlife or didn't believe in a soul, so once the person dies, you just have to dispose the body. What's the point of having a place to recognize the person even after they pass on? So that represents that you recognize that life endures. So that is a spiritual connection to the land. And then the commentary continues and explains, what's the next whole story? We're not going to have a lot of time to talk about it because we only have a few minutes left. But most of the parsha discusses Abraham looking for a wife for Eliezer, Abraham dispatching Eliezer to look for a wife for Isaac. And the number one criterion for a wife is chesed, is kindness. She's giving water to him, she's giving water to the camels. And this is a very interesting parallel, because kindness also is the opposite of amassing wealth. Because wealth represents, I want the wealth for myself. Kindness is transcending the self and giving it to others. So both those stories highlight the idea of giving and transcending, and that's the basis of our connection to the land of Israel. So that's just a little bit about that, a little introduction. Now we'll see if we want to get to the next story. And there's so much to talk about the next story because there's so many details. There's so many details to talk about. I think we'll take 2 minutes, and I'm going to mention something that I said earlier. I think I said it last night. And just because it's such a powerful point. And the powerful point is like this, that if you look at the story, what's strange about the story in the parsha is that the story is repeated so many times. Eliezer comes to the well and he makes a plan and he prays to God and he says, God, help me. And he says, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to ask a girl for water. And if the girl gives me water and also gives my camels, I know that that's the one. He has this plan in his head. We read that once, how he says it to God. Then we read how he actually executed the plan. And he went to the girl and he said, give me water. And she gives him water. And then she says, who are you? Etc. And then after that, so we already have it twice. Afterward, the girl brings him to her father's home, to her mother's home, to her brother's home. And he repeats the entire story again. And that's why the story that's not so complicated takes 67 verses. And it's basically, the portion is it's repeated at least twice, maybe some parts of it even 3 times. And that begs the question, why is the story repeated so many times? And the Medrash asks this question, as I mentioned last night. I think the Medrash asks the question, and the Medrash points out that shows that the stories of the servants of the patriarchs in some ways is more important than the Torah of the children, because there are many important laws of the Torah that we just learn from an extra word or an extra letter even. So there are many important parts of the Torah that are just written in the Torah just with an allusion. And yet the stories of the servants of the patriarchs, specifically this story, is repeated twice in the Torah. So this is in some ways more beautiful. That's what the Medrash says. Why is this more beautiful? Or what's the big deal? The Medrash, that's an observation. It's not an explanation. So there are all kinds of interpretations. There are many, many, many commentaries on this Medrash and explain why is it so important to repeat the story. And I guess the importance of kindness is very critical. But one Hasidic interpretation is as follows. What is the Torah all about? You say this story is more important than the Torah in some ways. What is the Torah all about? Torah is about spiritual connection to God. You study God's wisdom. You adapt the divine perspective. You study the Torah. What happens if my ox gores your ox? So what do you do? So this is how you solve the problem. You're getting an insight into the divine wisdom. But Torah, like prayer, is much more spiritual in nature. What is the essence of this story? The essence of the story is that Eliezer sees that Hashem is going to send the right girl for him, and he's going to try to figure out what to do. He'll ask a girl and he'll see, but essentially, he sees the hand of God in this story, in the event that happens in the world. And in fact, when he goes to the family of Eliezer, of Rebekah's family, and he tells them the story, and he tells the story in the way that they recognize, they take away the points. And what's the goal of the story? They say, Achen, indeed, me Hashem yatzah hadavar. This matter emerged from God. In other words, they see a series of coincidences, and because of the way Eliezer tells the story, and Eliezer himself sees the hand of God leading him through these quote-unquote coincidences, and he tells the story in that way that the family also acknowledge that this is the hand of God. And that is a much deeper message, in some sense, deeper than the Torah's message. Because the Torah's message is that you can find God in wisdom. You can find God in spirituality. But the story of Eliezer says you can find God in the marketplace. You can find God in the events that happen in your life. If you're open and you're looking and you see and you're open to divine providence, you will see Hashem leading you in the right path for you. And in some sense, that is even a deeper message than the Torah. And that's one comment, and that's one interpretation of why this reason is repeated so many times. The doctor asked a question. I just want to take 20 seconds and talk about. Also, I said it in the past, but when we did the class with the doctor, we talked about storytelling, and Eliezer is telling a story. And storytelling, what it means is you're taking many different random events that could be seen as random, and you're stringing them together and seeing one thread. And that's what Eliezer is doing. He's telling a story. And when he presents these facts to the family, he presents them in a way of story form. And story form means, could you see the common thread? And in this sense, the common thread is the hand of God leading Eliezer to Rebekah to make that shidduch, to make that a match for Isaac. And Rebekah will become the matriarch of the Jewish people. And her kindness becomes embedded within the collective DNA of the Jewish people, spiritual DNA of the Jewish people. Go ahead, doctor, please.
Rabbi, what do you make of the following? We talk about the search for a wife for Isaac, Rebekah, who has distinguished herself by a kindness, and kindness is the preeminent quality here. Clearly, in the description of Sarah, kindness is not the predominant quality. In fact, she was practical, she was tough, she kicks the other woman out, etc. So what do we make of the fact that two traits are so dramatically different in two of the most prominent women in our history?
What I would say is that just before I even try to address that, I just want to point out, Abraham is the epitome of kindness. His wife is much more strength, gevura, discipline. Isaac is seen in the Kabbalah as a man of discipline, and his wife is kindness. So you see in both couples, you have two different extremes. And then Jacob, the next generation, he already has 4 wives, so I don't know what's going on over there. But he, in his own personality, he's seen as the blend of kindness and discipline, and the Kabbalah, that's Tiferet, that's harmony. So the point here is both traits are necessary. And when we say kindness, kindness per se is not good, because if kindness just gives kindness to everybody all the time, and there's no discerning of when it's appropriate and how it's appropriate, and it's not channeled in the proper way, then it can cause damage. So kindness is necessary, but also the idea of restraint, of discipline is just as important. And within every couple, I don't want to say every couple, but within the first two couples of the Jewish people, you had the balance, and that produced a harmony of Yaakov, of Jacob. But also within every person, we need both. Now, with some people, the giving is more dominant and the restraint is less. And some people, it's the opposite. They're much more introverted, and they're much more about exacting, and they're much more about encouraging people to help themselves and giving help only in measure. And other people, the kindness is more dominant. But the short answer is that you must have both. Every relationship must have both. Every person must have both. The balance of how much of each is what makes us different than each other. Go ahead, please.
Rob, by how much, when a marriage is planned in a religious setting, is this kind of thinking taken into account? In other words, how much? Clearly, there was a great deal taken into account by Abraham when he said to his servant, "Go find this wife, because presumably my son, who has these personality traits, needs a wife who has those personality traits." Now, how much in an Orthodox family where they're prepared to meet with somebody who sort of introduces people, do they put forth that kind of specificity that we see in the Bible?
So I don't think there's one answer to that question. I think there's different answers, because some people want someone who's just like them. Some people want someone who's different than them, right? So I don't know that there's a rule, but I think there is an awareness to ask the question. Are you looking for someone more kind? Are you looking for someone more disciplined? Are you looking for someone more strong? So I think there's certainly an awareness. I don't think there's one answer to that question. If you want to apply it to our life, I would say that it's much more important to figure out in my life, is there Isaac in me? Is there Rebecca within me? Which one needs strengthening? And it's actually fascinating. I alluded to it in the beginning that Isaac, who is not the loving type, he's much more the stern type. It says that he loved Rebecca. And that's the first time you see love in the Torah explicitly. So it's actually interesting that in some sense, you need the discipline to have the love. And we talked about this all the time. We always keep repeating it, that love is the desire to be one, but love ultimately cannot flourish unless there's also respect. And respect is giving space and giving room and giving the other person the ability and the permission and the encouragement to have their own space and their own perspective. And being one doesn't have to mean you have to be like me. And in fact, if being one means we're all one and the same without giving the other person respect and space and space for themselves, ultimately that love could be turned into unhealthy dominance. And that's not true love. And the true love would be the harmony that comes from recognizing the differences. So it's ironic that the couple that has the first time the Torah says that there's love is when there's Isaac, who is respect, right? Because every relationship has to have that love and the respect, and that would be the Sarah and the Abraham. And we talked about the metaphor of the bird flying. You need two wings. You can't fly with one wing. A relationship would have to have both the respect and the love for it to be healthy and enduring. So there's a lot more to say, but we keep touching upon this because this is very critical and very fundamental to Judaism's understanding of relationships and the human soul and the Jewish people collectively. And that's why we have these opposing personalities in the first two generations. So that's the story in short. Comments, questions are welcome. Otherwise, we'll see each other in good health, meet each other next week for the next parsha. If you want more on this parsha, you have to come back next year in good health. God should give us many long years to continue studying the Torah with peace and harmony and only good things.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
About her being 3 years old. I mean, I know Rashi says that, but like, is there any more?
Not in the text. It's not in the text. No, it's not in the text. There's the Midrash that does the math and talks about how old she would have been at the time, and talks about how long they waited before she gave birth. So, but it's not actually in the text. There are
Right.
there are different opinions. It's not the only opinion. Rashi's quoting the Medrash, but there are other commentaries that say otherwise. Other classic commentators. I think the Even Ezra says otherwise, and others may also say otherwise.
Yeah, I've heard also 14 and 15, but since Rashi was going with that, is that the most accepted?
It's the most famous because Rashi is the Rashi. It's Rashi had good space on the Chumash, right? Rashi was the most prince of the Chumash, so he's got the best advertising space. So the most famous Medrashim are the ones that Rashi brings down. But it's certainly not the only opinion. It also doesn't necessarily mean that the marriage was consummated at the age 3, right? It means that they were sort of engaged at age 3, right?
And they would ask her at the age of 3,
So that would, if you're going to read it that way, you would have to say that represents how mature she was. But it is interesting that from this relationship, the Torah says you're not allowed to marry a girl without her permission. Because that, and it's quoted from this verse, Nikra la Na'ara, they say her brother and her mother and brother say, that's called a girl and ask her opinion. Right? So Rashi said, the Talmud says this is the source that you can't marry off a woman against her will. And it's almost like so many laws are not written explicitly in the Torah, but this law is derived from a story that is clearly in the Torah, and seemingly it's not critical for the story. You don't have to tell that in the story. It's not a critical part of the story. But yes, when you're talking about the first marriage, it is critical to say that she had to give her consent. Now, if you're going to say she was 3 years old, you would have to, the Medrash would then have to say that you would have to assume that she's a very mature 3-year-old. And that's why other commentaries that are less Midrashic inclined don't have other opinions about her age. But if you accept the Medrash, you would have to accept that in intelligence she was more mature than her years.
Does the Rebbe say anything about this that you know of?
Nothing offhand, nothing that I remember offhand. But just because I haven't seen it, that's no proof. That's no proof that it doesn't exist.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for joining, everybody. Have a wonderful day. And we'll see each other in good health, God willing. Thank you.
Amen.